So thanks for joining. I hope we have a good discussion on the Book of Revelation over the next 10 weeks or so. I think it'll be 11 weeks. I think we have a gap in there. I think Tim or somebody is out of town, so we're going to postpone 1 week. So as you are all probably aware, we had part one of the Revelation class last year in 2024, Q4. A lot of discussion came from that class, so after having those discussions and talking with the elders, with their guidance, we decided to do this class to follow up on some of those highly discussed topics and decide and have those discussions here on a Zoom call. We can talk about it. So I'm going to be presenting the first couple of weeks, and then the elders are going to take over for a few weeks as well on some topics. But I'll point out what those are here in a minute. So in our Revelation class last year, we part one I'd called the story of Revelation. Right, I think everybody here on this call was a part of that class. If you weren't, that class is on the website. You can go listen to it. But we went through the story of Revelation, right? The flow of thought. We introduced our keys, the audience, the background, time frame, style. And we talked about the message that the book conveyed, right? The idea that God's people are assured victory and the enemies who oppose and persecute them will be brought to an end. God makes that very clear. I believe that's the central message of the book of Revelation. Assured victory for the faithful and assured destruction for those who oppose the faithful. I don't believe there is any other accurate interpretation of this book. That being said, there are some alternate views regarding the historical context of this book, which is primarily what we'll be discussing in this class, I'm sure you're aware of. Those two major areas of discussion are the dating of the book, right? Whether the book is written in the 60s or the 90s of the first century, and then the focus of the book, whether we're talking about the destruction of the Roman Empire or the destruction of Jerusalem. Right, so those are really the two ideas what we're talking about, and that's what we're going to be talking about for the first 5 lessons of this class. Right, I'm calling it the scope of Revelation. Right, as we talk about the date and the focus of the book. Obviously, there's no hiding my beliefs on the subject, as I taught an entire quarter with a specific focus. I believe the book of Revelation was written in the 90s of the first century and addresses circumstances surrounding Christians at that time under the oppression of the Roman Empire. However, some do interpret the book differently. This study, like I said, came about as a result of a few people asking questions, challenging my views, and proposing that the early date and or a Jerusalem focus is a more accurate view of the book. So I'll say at the beginning of this class the same thing I said at the very beginning of that class, right? If you disagree with me on the date and the focus of the book, we can still have fellowship. We can disagree on some details of this book. That is okay. So I just want to make sure we keep that in mind because we are talking about some things that I know many of us might disagree on, and I think that's okay, right? I think that's the purpose of these discussions as we kind of lay those things out. That being said, there is a reason that I teach Revelation from the perspective that it was written in the 90s with a focus on the Roman Empire. I believe when examined in its entirety and harmonized with the rest of Scripture, that the evidence points clearly to this interpretation. So the first half of the class, like I said, the first 5 lessons will be taught by me. We're going to focus on this premise. I want to examine the evidence for the date and scope of the book and show why I believe that the late date and the Roman focus are the most appropriate interpretation. Not necessarily because I believe someone is in sin for disagreeing with me. Like I said, we can have fellowship, but because I believe there are real flaws in the opposing view that I want to openly and honestly discuss in this class. So the following 5 lessons, right after I'll present those first 5, the following will be what I'll call the abuse of Revelation, right? We'll have a 4-week discussion, really a 5th week on there as well. We'll have another discussion on that as well. But that'll be presented by the elders. And what we're going to talk about at that is somewhat the abuse of Revelation, right? As I said, I believe we can differ on the date of Revelation and still maintain fellowship. However, there is a significant amount of false doctrine that is taught and believed using the date, the early date, and Jerusalem as the foundation, right? It's those false ideas springing from this foundation that can prevent fellowship amongst us because they lead to interpretations that significantly change Scripture. And I'll be clear, I'm not suggesting that anyone here amongst us on this call or at West Main is holding to or teaching false doctrine. However, in order to ensure scriptural accuracy for all of us and proper contextual interpretation and continued fellowship in doctrinal truth, lessons 6 through 10 will focus on common misunderstandings and the misuse of revelation that often arises from these alternative views. So like I said, we'll get into the first half of this class, which I'm calling the scope of revelation, right? And Elena made fun of me for using this picture, but I thought it was kind of cool. This is the beast from chapter 13 of Revelation, right? The picture looks weird. Go reread chapter 13, and you'll see that's a pretty accurate picture of what's happening there, right? The beast is really what we're talking about here, right? This idea of the headship of the Roman Empire, or some might differ on what that beast is and what the enemies at play in this book are. So really that's what we're going to be talking about primarily as we talk about both the date and the focus of this book. So as we get into this first part of the class, right, the scope of Revelation, we're talking about, like I said, how to place a date on the writing of this book and why that's relevant. We're also looking at this book about whether this book is actually talking about Rome or whether it's talking about Jerusalem. So here up front, I want to give you a little bit of backstory about my research into the subject and kind of how I think a lot of these discussions have come about, at least for me. As you know, I taught Revelation last year, Q4 of 2024. I found out that I was teaching that class around like July or August of 2023, like a little over a year before I would start teaching it. I began thinking about what I might do differently this time around, if anything. And the obvious thing that stood out to me that I needed to spend more time on was the foundations for my beliefs about the historical context of the book. The first time that I taught Revelation was in 2013. And at that time, I was teaching from a book written by someone else who I did know personally. The material I present now is largely my own, but it's heavily influenced by the interpretations of that individual who first taught it to me. In 2015, I started researching more deeply as I began assembling what would become my own material that I've now been teaching for the past 10 years or so. And it's the same material I taught in our auditorium class last year. But if I'm being honest, up until 2023, right, when I started thinking about what I would do differently this time around, all of my research into the book of Revelation and its historical context had been done through the lens that the late date of Revelation was correct, with, I think, little to no foundational evidence of my own supporting it, through my own investigation, right? I had blindly trusted the person who taught it to me, and I ran with that for close to 10 years, I think, and just assumed that that was correct, right? I was aware of alternative views. I was also aware of the general consensus among many that there seemed to be evidence for both sides, and you could just pick which one you felt was best, and that was great. And so in September 2023, I set out to research for myself. That was something I just didn't feel solid about. Was I right in the fact that the book was written in the 90s, or had I been overlooking stronger evidence for a more accurate view? So that's what I set out to do throughout the entire year of 2024. And you fast forward to the end when I start teaching the Bible class in Q4. By then, I had strongly solidified my view in my mind that Revelation was clearly written in the 90s. As a result of that, and because of the content of the book, I concluded that there was no room to allow for a view that focused on the destruction of Jerusalem with that interpretation. So obviously this heavily influenced how I presented my material last year, although I didn't leave much time in that class to share what I had researched, which was a complaint by many. Because of those questions and the requests that I received, that's why I want to have this class. And I want to share with you the research that I've done and the things that I've found and the evidence that I believe helps us determine accurately the dating and the historical context of this book. So I'm going to share that evidence with you. But before I do that, I want to go ahead and share with you what I think is a revolutionary realization that I made about this book during my research process. Okay, something that I discovered for myself that I think is a foundational realization that is often overlooked when trying to determine the date of the book. Are you ready? This is revolutionary, okay? The entire book of Revelation was written at the same time. Okay, I know what you're thinking, right? Cody, revolutionary is a strong word, okay? And you're right, right? That's not revolutionary, all right? You're all probably going, well, duh, right? You'd be right to say that. It's not revolutionary in the sense that it's some deep mystery that no one's ever uncovered. In fact, it seems kind of obvious, doesn't it? Right? Most of us, if asked, would probably say, yeah, John wrote the whole thing in one go. But here's the key. Even though we all probably agree with this statement, that the entire book was written at the same time, the way that many people argue about the dating of the book, myself included previously, tells a different story. It's one thing to say that Revelation was written at the same time. It's another thing entirely to let that fact shape the way we approach the evidence towards the dating of the book. Because what I found as I began to look at books and articles and conversations on the topic is that people, including myself, like I said, tend to build two separate piles of evidence. One pile for the early date and one for the late date. And then we weigh them against each other and everybody just picks whichever list they believe is longer or stronger, and that's how we go with it. But here's why that doesn't work. If Revelation was written all at once, then that means that all of the internal details, the references, the images, the historical allusions, must all fit into a single historical moment. Not two, not both or either one, just one. And this means this is not about collecting lists and comparing which side the book seems to be pointing to most. It's about identifying which moment in history can make the most sense of every single detail of this book. If even one major detail from the book of Revelation cannot fit within either of the two dates, then the date can't work. Because as we said, the entire book was truly written at one time. It does not point to two separate dates. So suddenly, this simple idea that the whole book was written at the same time becomes incredibly important. It forces us to stop cherry picking what supports my view and what supports someone else's view, and really ask a deeper question. Which date works to support the entire book? All of the details in the book, all of the true and right evidence that we might find in history or archaeology or these other things, all of it has to fit into one of the two dates, if not another one. So that's what I want to do in this class. We're going to test both the late date and the early date and the full weight of the evidence, both internal to the book as well as external, archaeology, history, things like that, to see which of the two dates can encompass the entire thing. Now, obviously, like I said, spoiler, you know which date I believe does that, right? So you can expect that my class will be from that perspective. So while this is not the most jaw-dropping statement in history, I genuinely believe that if we can keep this in mind, it can help us in our interpretation of the book, as well as figuring out the historical moment that all of this takes place in. Which brings me to this that I'll say is really my thesis for this class. What I want to show through some of the rather technical and complicated evidences that we'll look at is this, that the internal and historical evidence regarding the book of Revelation overwhelmingly supports a late date. Every detail in the book aligns more naturally and cohesively with the late date view, making it the most consistent framework for interpretation. So because of this, right, that's the approach we're going to take, is seeing how all of the evidence, whether it's evidence that I believe fits my interpretation or evidence that seems to support the other, which date can truly encompass everything. So that's kind of an introduction to the class as a whole, to the next 5 weeks at least, and then that will obviously spill over into the second half as well. But for tonight, for the first lesson, what we're going to talk about is understanding first century Roman history. So this is going to be a little bit of a history class for the rest of our time. But I think this is essential, right? As we talk about where this book fits into the time period, I think we need to know the time period very well. So I want to go through the entire first century, and if we have time, we'll spill over into the second century and beyond. and really lay out the framework for what history looks like so that we can then fit Revelation inside of it. So as we work to understand first century Roman history, accurate first century Roman history, right, this is going to help us fully grasp Revelation. For first century, the Roman Empire shaped every aspect of the life of Christians, especially as they faced persecution and obviously things like emperor worship that becomes very important to this discussion, and the cultural presence and the way people react to the government around them. Without this context, it is very easy to miss the point of Revelation. As we know, if you remember lesson 1 from the first Revelation class, we focused on this idea, right, that we have to understand the background of the book to make sense of it. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about a chronological timeline of Rome's rulers and the relationship with Christianity, the rise of imperial cult worship and how it connects to the book of Revelation, the escalation of Christian persecution throughout the first century and what that looked like. And if we have time, we'll talk about the status of the empire beyond the first century and how that validates the warnings of Revelation. So we're going to start off in 27 BC with the Julio-Claudian dynasty, right? So this marks the very beginning of the Roman Empire with a man named Augustus. So Augustus was the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Does anybody know what Rome existed as prior to it being an empire? Open question.
Noah says kingdom.
A kingdom, okay. Certain type. The structure of the government.
Was it a republic of some sort?
Correct. It was a republic. Do you know what the difference between republic and empire is? Key
Representation.
differences.
And
Okay.
I think if I understood correctly, and I'm not a history expert, but I thought there were like, I forgot some number, 7 or 13 or some number of representatives that were responsible for electing the person to be a leader. So it was a representative in that way, although it wasn't a general democracy like we think about it in America.
Right. So it's a form of an elected ruler, right, is what would take place in a republic. Somebody is chosen by a body of people, typically the Senate is what they would be referred to. So the Senate would select an individual to represent the people to make decisions. But there's checks and balances. That's the point of the emperor and the Senate. They would work together the same way we could think about our president working with the Senate and the House of Representatives and things like that. It's the same type of thing, right? Checks and balances to keep everybody in line. That's what existed prior to the empire. The final elected ruler of the republic, does anybody know who that was? You'll know the name. Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar was the final elected ruler of the Roman Republic. However, unlike all of the rulers before him, he wasn't a great one. He did not want to give up power. Typically, rulers in a republic will serve for a specific term, similar to our leaders now in our country. Julius Caesar did not want to go at the end of his term. He didn't want there to be an end of his term. So he had the Senate appoint him as what he called dictator for life. So he became dictator of the republic, which completely undermined the principles of the republic. And so with that idea, he was not well accepted. Julius Caesar, as you probably know, was murdered at the end of his life due to the tyrannical rule that he had. And it left a little bit of a void after that, but ultimately his place was filled by his adopted son, Augustus, who was previously known as Octavian. So Octavian, or now known as Augustus, he won a battle over a few others who were fighting for leadership during the void between Julius Caesar and the empire. Augustus won. He changed his name from Octavian to Augustus, which means revered one, which we'll talk about in just a second. And he labeled himself as the leader of the Roman Empire now. He did not want to go through the same things that his adopted father did, of having a term put an end to his time in office. And he wanted full say over how things were to run. So that leads to the restructure of the Republic to now be known as the Empire of Rome. And so now no longer elected leaders, and now no longer checks and balances where a Senate can balance the decisions that are made by the emperor. The emperor rules over all and is the final authority on all decisions. That is what Augustus put in place to begin the Roman Empire. He named himself the Revered One. Many people saw Julius Caesar as one of the gods, and so Augustus called himself the Son of God, right? He believed himself to be a son of a god and should be revered as a god, just as his father was. He referred to himself this way, and this marks the very beginning, at the very beginning of the empire, this idea of placing the emperor at a higher level than men, putting him equal with all of the other gods that Roman culture had. The Senate also backed him on this and declared him a god amongst all as well, and encouraged other people to view him and treat him the same way. This is not a worldwide decree of emperor worship by any means. This was merely a label for Augustus to be known that he was something special. He was something important. He was something to be seen with power. And so that is why he became known as Augustus, the Revered One. I believe that when the empire began with Augustus, this is the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 2. If you remember back to Daniel chapter 2, right, Daniel is interpreting the vision, right, of the 4 different materials. And in that fulfillment, we see 4 different nations mentioned. And the 4th of those nations is mentioned as being the nation that would be in power at the time that God brought about an eternal nation. Obviously, we know that eternal nation is the church, the kingdom of God, right? Augustus was in power at the time that Jesus was born. So he is leading the world into the Roman Empire just at the start of Jesus coming into the world. And he was followed by a man named Tiberius. So Tiberius is the person who was in rule during Jesus' crucifixion, right? During Jesus' ministry, Tiberius was the emperor of the time. He was known as an unpredictable and cruel ruler, not very well received by many people. He was cruel to people. He had very unfair punishments and very unjust principles. He lived in self-isolation. He didn't want to have to see the people he was ruling. He didn't want to have to be around those people. So he appointed people to go out into different places of the world who would answer back to him. He lived isolated from the world on the island of Capri. And ruled through his ministers, if you can call them that, through the entire world. And so you merely at this time, you really only see men who answered to Tiberius. Pilate, we're all familiar with Pilate, right? When Jesus is on trial right before his death, he has to go before Pilate. Pilate answers to Tiberius, right? Just to put the people in their context here. Tiberius is the one in charge at that time in history. And he ruled from AD 14 to AD 37, so just a few years after Jesus died would be the end of his rule. And that led way to a man named Caligula. Caligula was the first of the emperors to declare himself a god and also demand that he be worshipped as one. So unlike Augustus, who merely just thought he was a god and wanted people to call him a god, Caligula wanted to be worshipped, and he demanded this worship. This was a new extreme in Roman civilization, right? No one had been this way before or acted this way, and as a result, you could see he ruled from 37 AD to 41. He didn't last that long because he was seen as a very tyrannical ruler because of this view. In his attempts to be worshipped, he spread out statues of himself all throughout the world to be worshipped. One of those major statues being put in the city of Jerusalem. This is important because this marks the moment, the real moment where revolt and rebellion started officially forming in the city of Jerusalem against the Roman Empire. Heavily by the Jews, but not exclusive to the Jews. This statue being placed in Jerusalem caused a very significant problem for the empire. A lot of political unrest came as a result of this. And as a result, you see a lot of fighting, a lot of battles, a lot of war, civil wars, more internal fights, things to the point that Caligula was assassinated by his own guard. Not exclusively as a result of this statue, right? I don't mean to imply that, but his attitude towards himself, largely his ego, pit a lot of people against him, and ultimately he was assassinated by the people who were meant to protect him. So here, like I said, you see the beginnings of specifically Jewish issues with the Roman Empire, here with Caligula. As we move forward, we see a man named Claudius from 41 to 54. Claudius was involved in the Jewish expulsion, right? So in Acts chapter 18, verse 2, there's actually a mention of this, right? A decree was sent out by Claudius called the Edict of Claudius that expelled Jews from Rome, which clearly would have affected Christians as well, although it wasn't specifically targeted at Christians. Many Christians were previously Jews, as we know. Because of the political unrest that Caligula left him with due to the statue in Jerusalem and the rebellions that began taking place, Claudius issued this decree to get all Jews out of Rome, to make sure that no Jews were left to cause any kind of political problems, right? This is what Claudius focused on. He focused on strengthening the infrastructure and the military of the empire, right? Eliminating problems for the empire, right? So the Jews would not have been the only thing he dealt with. I just mention it here because it's obviously relevant to our discussion. But that is one of the things he did in his mission to strengthen the infrastructure of the empire. Claudius was responsible in his 13 years or so of rule for really building the empire up very strong and increasing its reach throughout the world. Claudius was seen by many as doing a good job of building the empire. And it was the strength of the empire that he left for a man named Nero. Now, this is probably a name you're familiar with. So as we get to Nero, we're in the from AD 54 to AD 68. This is the time period that we're talking about when we talk about the early date of the book of Revelation, right? That the early date was written during the time of Nero's reign. And so that would mean that we would be looking to Nero to see some of the details that the book of Revelation is describing when it talks about the historical context and the circumstances that the people are going through. So as we talk about Nero, right, he inherited a very strong empire from Claudius. And so he continued that forward, pushing the strength of the empire. I mentioned this in the first Revelation class, but in the year 64 AD, there was a great fire in the city of Rome. People were looking at who was responsible for this fire, and fingers started getting pointed at Nero, right? He was taking the heat for the fire, right? No pun intended there, right? But he started taking the blame for it. And in order to shift blame from himself, he started looking for an out. Who can I place the blame on to eliminate this problem and to get people to stop looking at me? Well, if you think back historically leading up to this, right? You have the Jews who had been causing a problem for Rome. And now you've got this group of Christians who were really mostly viewed as kind of a radical sect of the Jews. It became a great place to throw attention. And so the Christians got blamed for this fire by Nero. And though we can't prove it, many people believed that it was strictly to remove blame from himself for the fire. He ordered executions of Christians, burning them alive, throwing them to wild animals, crucifying them, and mostly doing this in the city of Rome, but doing this for a purpose, to show people Christians were guilty. He was not guilty, right? This was done repeatedly to push that image into people's minds of Christianity guilty, Nero, the one punishing the guilty, right? All to avoid the blame being put on himself. And that intensified under his rule. Peter and Paul were martyred during this time. Again, Christian persecution escalated at this time in history, largely as a result of the fire, but it extended past that, and Christians got a lot more attention. And as we know, Jesus said while he was on earth, right, that people would hate Christians as a result of the things that Jesus did and said. as a result of him, right? And so obviously that continued under the reign of Nero. Nero accepted honors as one of the gods, and this is an important point, right? As one of the gods, right? The Roman civilization had many gods. They were a polytheistic nation, or a polytheistic empire. They had lots of gods, and Nero was placed on the same level as all the rest, right? He believed himself to be one of the gods, but really more so, he just simply accepted the title. He didn't really push it. We don't have any evidence of him pushing or promoting himself as God, but merely accepting those types of honors when it suited him. Right? You see lots of cities or cities and other countries whose leaders would have parties and parades and things honoring the god Nero, right? All to butter him up. People were trying to get on Nero's good side, and calling him a god was a great way to do it. And that's really how this idea of Nero being a god came about, is people just trying to boost his ego and get something out of him. And that idea continued through many days, through the days of Nero. Definitely puffed up his ego. And Nero, through his treatment of Christians, as well as others, and his acceptance of these honors, he became very corrupt. And he was not seen as a good ruler. And to the point that as you get to the year 68 AD, which would be the end of his reign, there was a series of revolts, people rising up to try to remove Nero from power. And Nero ultimately committed suicide in AD 68. Not wanting to be removed from the position by anyone else, he removed himself from that position. Lots of speculation about really the deep reasons as to why, but it became somewhat sudden. Nobody was really expecting a man like Nero in his position to commit suicide, but he did in AD 68. And it was with the death of Nero that we come to the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, right? Typically, rule would get passed within families or from one person to the next who had power. When Nero committed suicide, things got chaotic in the Roman Empire. And that led us into what is called the Year of Four Emperors in the year AD 69. In the year AD 69, you have four different men within the span of 12 months as emperor of Rome, right? That's how unstable things were. That's how frequently people were pushing and fighting for this type of leadership. And that began with a man named Galba. In June of 68, right after Nero committed suicide, he took power. And he ruled until January of 69. So just about 6-7 months or so that he was in power. Not a good guy. This guy was seen as corrupt. He was a tyrant in the same way that Nero was. And people did not want to go through another Nero. And so he was killed by his own guard. He was overthrown by his own guard and removed from power because people were so fearful of him coming into a tyrannical rule. And he was followed by Otho. Otho took power, and he sought to keep that power, but so did everyone else. Like I said, political unrest, you've got many people fighting for power. Rome broke out into a civil war in this year, right? With the very quick departure of Galba, and now Otho in the position of the emperor. You have a man named Vitellius who comes to challenge him, as well as many others, right? But there's this great battle. Vitellius beats Otho in this battle, and Otho, right, these are not my words, this is the historical account, was doing the noble thing by committing suicide to prevent a civil war. That was the end of his life. He knew that continuing to fight would continue the civil war. He didn't want to be the cause of the civil war continuing, so he nobly killed himself. That's at least the popular story. If that's the real reason, we don't really know, but that's at least the official story that was circulating at the time. I'll leave that with you because there's not really much more to say about it. Vitellius, like I said, was the man who killed him, or at least his forces killed Otho. Vitellius comes into power. Also not a good man. He was seen as a glutton. He was seen as incompetent. Many people thought him to be stupid, for a lack of a better word. Did not want him in power, so he ruled from April to December. And in December, he was killed by Vespasian. who would put an end to the year of 4 emperors, and Vespasian would restore stability to the empire. So the year of 4 emperors was chaotic. It was a fight for power. Vespasian came in, restored stability in December of 69, and Vespasian would begin what's known as the Flavian dynasty, right? This is the family that they were a part of. Vespasian was in power from 69 to 79. Vespasian is actually the man who came in and ordered the siege on Jerusalem. So we're talking about the year AD 70, right? The destruction of Jerusalem was ordered by Vespasian, right? Vespasian's purpose, his focus when he came into power, was to regain stability, right? No longer have this year of 4 emperors, no longer have the quick transitions of power, restabilize. And so his solution was to start eliminating problems. Like I said, lots of problems, not just the Jews, but the Jews had definitely proved a problem for Rome over the last few decades. So the order was made to destroy Jerusalem to put an end to this problem that would combat Rome. So in order to strengthen the empire, he destroyed Jerusalem. And he had that done by at least one of his sons. He allowed his 2 sons, Titus and Domitian, a name you're familiar with, to gain power and to have some authority. Titus, his son, is actually the one who he sent out to destroy Jerusalem. So Titus led that charge in that destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And Vespasian himself died from an illness. After 10 years of rule, nobody really knows what the illness was. But the transition from Vespasian to Titus was said to be the most peaceful transition of power in the Roman Empire's history. Man dies and peacefully passes power to his son because he knows he's sick. Very peaceful. Titus, as I said, was the one who destroyed the Jewish temple in AD 70, fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus in Matthew 24. He had a very short, relatively peaceful reign. You can see he reigned from AD 79 to AD 81, so just a couple of years. Relatively peaceful, right? Continuing the rule of similar to his father Vespasian, increasing the strength of the empire, eliminating problems that would face them. But he died suddenly in AD 81, and from what I can find, nobody really knows the cause of his death. There is a rumor. I'll tell you it's entirely a rumor. There's not a lot of evidence for it, but there is a rumor that his little brother Domitian wanted power and poisoned him because it was said that he came very ill very quickly, like suspiciously quickly, and then died very suddenly. And so many people thought it was poison, started looking for reasons. A lot of people blamed Domitian, although no evidence was ever found to support that. So we really don't know what brought about Titus's end. But it happened way sooner than expected and allowed his little brother, Domitian, to come into power. Here again, Domitian is a name that we know. Domitian is we're now at the other end. We've arrived at the late date of Revelation, right? This is the time period that the late date would be pointing to. So, again, same thing as I said with Nero. If the book was written during the time of Domitian, we would expect that the symbols and the statements made in the book to align with the time frame and the historical context that Domitian brings about. So as we talk about Domitian declared himself Lord and God. This was similar to the way other emperors had acted in the past, but with one key difference, right? He was Lord and God. You notice I purposefully capitalized God on this slide. It's not a mistake, because that's what he believed. He believed himself to be the God, not equal with all other gods, but the God, the only God, and as a result should be worshipped because of that. He began empire-wide persecution of anyone who opposed this view, anyone who was not willing to call him God. He was going to do something bad too, right? There's lots of secular writings about the things that Domitian did. One of those is a secular writing that tells us that he was the one who exiled John to Patmos. And John actually says he was writing the book of Revelation on the island of Patmos. So again, there's one piece of evidence up front, to this date being correct. But he executed people for refusing to worship him. And again, something important to note here that I think is overlooked by a lot of resources on this topic is Domitian attacked anyone who opposed him as God, not exclusively Christians. Anyone. So if you think about in a world of all kinds of people, do you think Christians were the only people who did not want to bow down to this very obviously man to worship him as a god, right? Christians were not alone, right? There were many people all throughout the world who stood in defiance of Domitian, and Domitian targeted all of them. Christians were a percentage of the people that Domitian targeted, claiming them to be atheists for not worshiping him as God. This was one of the many missions that Domitian set out on when he took power. He was a power-hungry, egotistical maniac, and everyone knew it. He was not viewed well by most of the people. His rule was very tyrannical, and people were not happy living under the reign of Domitian. It was a struggle for anyone who was not willing to bow down and worship him as a god. And so right there, so we get to the end of the 1st century, right? Domitian marks the end of the Flavian dynasty, right? So up to this point, we've talked about the history that I think is most relevant to our discussion. And I think it's very clear from the historical account and what we know about the book of Revelation that right off the bat, Domitian fits the description of the beasts much closer than Nero did, right? And so we're going to talk about that a little bit as we compare Nero and Domitian, because really this is the crux of the argument that we're talking about in as far as the historical account of Rome is whether the moment of history during Nero's time or Domitian's time best fits the book. So as we talk about the rise of emperor worship during this time specifically, we've already mentioned much of it, but let's just hit those beats again. Augustus, the very first emperor, claimed to be the son of God and felt himself to be revered as a result. Caligula expanded the cult of Rome to enforce himself as one of the many gods. Nero accepted worship as one equal to the gods, although he didn't enforce it or promote it himself. Domitian declared himself the only god, and worldwide worship was mandatory, and you were an atheist if you felt otherwise. Again, that's the path that emperor worship took. So as we hone in specifically to compare these two, we'll give the details, and then we're really going to put these things in their context in the book in the next coming weeks. But as we talk about the details of Nero around this topic, like I said, he accepted honors. He didn't promote it himself. We have no real indication that he, in Rome or outside of Rome, spent any effort to force people to hold this view. He simply accepted from those who were willingly offering it to him, and the flattery. And he truly did favor the people who treated him this way, right? Very corrupt. But that's the path he took. He didn't utilize the emperor cult outside of the city of Rome, right? We know that cult that existed, that Caligula actually really established, although it existed before that, established and used. We have no record of him using it outside of the city of Rome. He used it to do his bidding within the city, to keep peace in the city, to carry out his actions against the Christians regarding the fire that we talked about. But as far as outside of Rome, we don't have any mention of Nero sending this cult outside of Rome. Like we said, he didn't self-promote. He rather accepted the flattery. He was not known to demand worship. He simply accepted it when it suited him. And he persecuted Christians primarily in Rome to avoid the blame for the fire in 60 AD, right? That's the real motivation we see from Nero in his persecution efforts, is this fire and the blame. Although there may have been more, this is really what's historically talked about most in regards to that context. So as we compare that to Domitian, directly comparing it, right? As we said, no longer one of the gods, the only God, and demanding worship, relying on the emperor cult to enforce that worship. And he made a requirement throughout the entire empire to be labeled as God, and he persecuted anyone, and like I said, this is important, not just Christians, but Christians were obviously included, worldwide, who did not worship him as God. Right? So right off the bat, like we said, I would encourage you in the next week to reread chapter 13 of Revelation with this framework in mind, right? With the historical account of these two men and how they treated themselves and the empire that they led, which of the two dates looks more closely to what chapter 13 actually describes? And we're going to do that in the class next week as well, in the next coming weeks, so you're not leaving you to do that all on your own. Let's see. Let's talk real quick about the fall of the Roman Empire before I move on to talking about specifics. So we've talked about the first 100 years of the empire. We're now going to talk about the last 300 on rapid fire, because much less happens, and it's much less of it is relevant to our discussion, although some of it will be. Moving up in my notes here. So we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, right? Domitian was murdered. I didn't mention that a minute ago. Domitian was murdered by the people closest to him. He had gotten so tyrannical and so out of control that he was killed by the people closest to him. He was stabbed in the back 7 times. Don't know if there's any coincidence there or not. But he was stabbed 7 times in the back, and his rule came to an end. And he was replaced by a man named Nerva. Nerva was selected by the Senate, which was unusual in an empire, but he was selected by the Senate as a compromise appointment. Nerva was weak. He didn't have the support of a lot of people. He didn't have the support of the military. And to avoid another tyrant like Domitian, Nerva was selected to rule, to let things cool off. Domitian's death was the start of a new period of political instability where the head of the empire was under very heavy scrutiny. And now, no longer were emperors being chosen by bloodline, but by necessity, what the empire needed most to try to continue to survive. Because Domitian left a rather strong empire, but he left it in such a state that it was falling apart, right? Spending so much money on expanding and having worship done to himself, over expansion, getting too egotistical with how he proceeded around the world, right? You left the Roman Empire on the brink of collapse, right? If you remember back to the last lesson of our class last year, I talked about some of those causes that came about. So you can reference back to that if you're interested. But Nerva was weak, so he did not stick around very long. So then you have this period of time which is called the 5 good emperors. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antonius Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. But it's called the 5 good emperors because these emperors were seen as good, right? They didn't get on people's nerves. They didn't ruffle feathers. But what that also means is they weren't really leading. They made valiant attempts to re-strengthen the empire that was dying after the damage that Domitian had caused. But things were declining. The empire was shrinking. It was getting smaller. There was a lot more unrest and definitely political unrest. I would describe the Roman Empire as a chicken with its head cut off. Right? The leader has been cut off, and now no real leader has been put in its place. These 5 good emperors simply kept things going. Right, put things on autopilot. Not a lot happened until Marcus Aurelius dies, and a man named Commodus comes onto the scene as emperor, and Commodus was very corrupt. He saw that not a lot was happening, that the Roman Empire was shrinking, that their influence was diminishing, and he didn't want to stand for it. So he went fighting vigorously to re-expand and re-establish the Roman Empire as a political force, but he was not received well, and he sent Rome into a civil war. So at this time, people are now fighting for what the future of the Roman Empire is going to be. Rome was very fragile. And so Rome was passed to the Severan dynasty, which was a family, the Septimus Severus family. And in order to try to appease the people and to lead in a way that people would be accepting, leadership was shared at this time. Again, a different approach for an empire. Leadership was shared by many members of a family, sons, wives, family members, all given authority at different times and over different things. And as you can imagine, scattered leadership and split leadership is not great leadership. That is what it led to, is disjointed leadership, different decisions being made at different places in the world. Things were not meshing well, and as a result, the empire is continuing in its steep decline. There is no recovery at this point. Till you get to the crisis of the 3rd century. Again, continued decline, but now the split leadership of the Severan dynasty did not work. People knew that. And so again, all-out battle for who was going to be emperor. This is a very similar time period to the Year of 4 Emperors. People are fighting for power. You've got 26 different emperors over the span of 50 years. So, and if you look at the list of those men, I think the longest one got 15 years, but most of them are around about the 2-year mark. Some of these men didn't even remain in power long enough for people to know they were in power. You had one man in power for only 22 days. So, right, think about that in a world where there's no social media, no news headlines. Hey, guess who's in power today? By the time the message reached the other side of the world, he was dead. Somebody had killed him to take his place, right? I mean, this is the unrest that continued throughout all of this time. The chaos continued, and it just could not recover. And as a result, if you think about all of the men trying to be leaders, internally fighting each other, what's happening outside of that? Invasions, collapse from the outside. Nobody's focusing on defense. Nobody's focusing on infrastructure because they're worried so much about power. And that's what took place, to try to fill that power void. And so you have ongoing division for the next couple hundred years, right? From 286 to the end, to the official end of the Roman Empire in 476. It is nothing but division. It is nothing but a fight for power. It is nothing but a decline in the power and influence of the Roman Empire and their ability to make any kind of change in the world. Countless failed attempts over the couple hundred years, to regain power. But it failed on every front. So as we talk about Rome past the 1st century, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, a lot of people want to look to this and say, did Rome still exist? Yes. Therefore, the book of Revelation cannot be talking about Rome because Rome still existed. Now we're going to talk about this. This is just a precursor into the next few weeks, but we're going to talk about this a little bit more, right? But if we look at the fall of the Roman Empire, again, something that you can look at in the coming week, if we look at the focus of the judgment in the book of Revelation, the focus of the judgment is on the beasts, which would be the political headship and those who enforce it, and the harlot in chapter 17, right? The immoral culture that came with that political power, right? The book of Revelation is talking about removing political power, not necessarily specifically wiping Rome off of the face of the earth, but removing the political power so that the problems would ensue and that empire would come to an end. And we're going to show that a little bit more. But following Domitian's death, the Roman Empire had no head. The power that this empire held disappeared and was never found again. The decline we see follow Domitian makes sense following what God said he would do. The effects of the judgment that we see in chapter 16 and chapter 17 and forward in the book of Revelation, it describes economic hardships. It describes unrest by all of the people on the earth who had once followed Rome or the beasts. Right, and that's exactly what we see happen through all of these men, the good emperors, and then the civil wars, and the political unrest, and the fights for power. Rome was in chaos. Rome was falling apart. Rome was suffering as a result of the political headship being demolished by Domitian. So this describes perfectly what happened to Rome, and Revelation tells us that this was caused by God, right? That this empire being brought to its knees, and all of these things were as a result of God removing the head from the beast. God will win, and he will bring an end to the enemies of his people. So I believe, like I said, the late date is what fits most accurately into this history, as well as what I believe the primary cause of decline being the inability to establish leadership and power following Domitian. Right, so this is really what we're going to hone in on now on the next couple weeks. Right, we're going to spend some time talking specifically about the date, early versus late. We're going to look at arguments for both sides and how those things fit into the historical context as well as the internal context of the book of Revelation. And we're also going to then talk about the idea of Rome versus the focus on Jerusalem. We mentioned some tonight, the destruction of Jerusalem, and some believe that that is what the book is talking about. So we're going to talk about those two things. But really, I wanted to get this first lesson laid out the way that I did because it is crucial for us to understand history, to understand why this book was written and the purpose it served, and especially when it was written. So again, I know tonight was very history focused, but hopefully you learned a little bit of something about the Roman Empire. And keep these things in mind because they're going to be very important in our discussions over the next couple of weeks. So this time, I'll go ahead and wrap it up. And if anybody's got any comments or questions on anything we talked about so far, I can do that. Just let me know if you got anything.
No, thanks for that. I have a quick question. You may or may not be able to help. I was just thinking about Claudius in Acts 18 and, sending all the Jews away. Then we find out, that Aquila and Priscilla were sent out at that time, right? And then so Claudius was, I guess, telling all the Jews to leave Rome. But I'm assuming that they went back if he greets them in Romans, the 16th chapter. So they went back maybe after Claudius died, and it was at Nero that was after Claudius.
Nero followed Claudius, yes. Yeah, so the scope of the Edict of Claudius, right, as far as who had to leave, right? So if you think about, obviously anyone still practicing Judaism was expected to leave, right? Many people were now Christians who had been previously Jews. Whether they got caught in that and had to leave, I don't know, but I assume they would have been worried or fearful of that, but maybe they weren't expected to leave if they could confidently stand up and say we're no longer of the Jewish nation, right? How they handled that, I'm not sure. There also would have been Christians who were Gentiles left in the city of Rome, right? So we know that Christianity in Rome would not have gone away entirely because those who were never Jews may not have gotten targeted by that edict as well. But as far as Jews returning to Rome, I don't know specifically. I would imagine Jews had a hard time through the end of the reign of Nero. I think a lot of the focus on Jews and Christianity kind of let up after Nero a little bit. Not entirely, but a little bit. Galba, who came in after Nero, although not a great guy, pretty bad ruler, he did seem to let off of the Jew-Christian argument a little bit, because I think he knew that was some of the heat Nero was taking was as a result of that, and he didn't want to fall into that. So we don't see as much from Galba on that front. Again, you get later now, just a year later to Vespasian, right? You're back to Roman Empire targeting the Jewish nation. So there wasn't a lot of time period in there for the Jews to be safe at the hands of Rome. Anyways, long story short, I don't know the specifics of whether Jews were allowed back into the city of Rome. I would assume they were.
I was just thinking, when Aquila and Priscilla went back, they were Christians, for sure. So, that's when Paul is addressing them as Christians. I was just thinking, man, so they probably thought, okay, it's okay to go back. Claudius is dead. Nero is now in power. But Nero then began demonstrating his hatred of Christians for political gain.
Yeah, but if you think about that too, though, Nero came into power in 54, right? The fire didn't happen until 64. So you've got 10 years in there that it wouldn't seem that Nero had any focus on Christians or Jews. Maybe some on the Jews, but we don't know. We don't have any record of the degree that he went after him. So it really wasn't until 10 years later, 10 years into his rule, that things would have picked up. So yeah, I think you're right. There was a 10-year period that Jews may very well have felt safe going back.
Well, because you think, Romans was probably written around 57, 58 AD, and that's during that time period, right, where they were like, okay, obviously Aquila and Priscilla were back in Rome, and it's during that time period. So then it kind of ramped, 6, 7 years later, anyway, I'm just trying to piece together their journey, because that kind of shows whether the persecution was severe or not during certain periods of time, that like they left, that tells us that's why they left. Claudius had an edict, and then we found them back there during a period where they felt like they could live there as Christians in Rome for a period of time. So I don't know. I just think that's interesting what the Bible at least gives me those little time markers about that.
Yeah.
So the end of Acts, Stephen, right? Acts 28, when Paul gets to Rome, right? Which early 60s, right? Probably.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Verse 29, and when he had said these words, who does he refer to? The Jews departed, right? So there were definitely Jews referenced there, right? So not just Christians. Those are Jews, right? As you consider the context, I think, right, of 28. So I would say, there were Jews. There were Jews there, right, at that time.
And that's definitely, and when Paul was there, it's definitely Nero in power.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. No, I'm agreeing with you, right? There was clearly, I think, right at that particular time, because like Cody said, the fire and the excuse to blame it on somebody else that Nero used, right, which is well documented by Cody, which is what happened there. Again, isolated to the persecution there in Rome. Anyway, just agreeing. Just agreeing with you.
That's a great point. No, that's a great point, Kevin. So we know, at least we have evidence that there's Jews and Christians back in Rome during the reign of Nero. When was Nero's reign ended, Cody? When did you say it was over?
68.
68. Okay.
Yeah.
So, and really the persecution of Christians during his reign, local to Rome, was more towards the end. Was it last 4 years or so of his?
From 64 to 68 is really when that happened. Yeah.
Okay, I got you. I'm just trying to compare the persecution they would have been under there versus Domitian. I'm trying to think through it in my mind. What was the severity of that persecution of Nero versus Domitian, just based on that evidence alone in the Bible? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, because in fairness, the severity of the persecution in a localized sense was fairly similar, right? As far as what Christians experienced in Rome versus what Christians experienced in the entire world during Domitian, right? But that's the key difference, right? That the severity was local within Nero, right? The burning alive, throwing to animals, all those kinds of things happened, right? But now you get to Domitian. Domitian is on a worldwide hunt for anybody to oppose him, right? It's a very different scope of the persecution, right? So as you read, really chapter 13 through, 18 of the book of Revelation, right? We're clearly talking about the world. We're not talking about specifically one city, Rome. We're not talking about a localized situation. The book is not even to Christians in Rome, right? So we're talking about Christians experiencing this outside the city of Rome. That's the book's audience, right? Tells us that, right? So the book at large is speaking about persecution on a much grander scale than just the Christians in Rome at the time of Nero.
Is it known? So Domitian's reign was 14 or 15 years?
Roughly, yeah.
Okay.
81 to 96.
Okay. So, and it seemed as though the persecution that Domitian inflicted was during a much longer period of time as well.
Yes. He came into power with the idea that he was the man, right? And that's really why, as we talk about Titus's death, right, being sudden and unexpected, that's why those accusations started coming up. Is like Domitian thought very highly of himself as a ruler from the get-go. His older brother just mysteriously died to allow him to be ruler, right? I mean, you see how people's mind starts going from his actions leading to that. Again, not that we have any evidence that Domitian did that, right? But you can see the logic in people's mind coming about because of how he treated people as a whole and how he viewed himself in that position. And it was crazy.
Yeah, you made I'll make a couple comments, Cody. So in your opening, you talked about your revelation moment there of letter, and that's true. 1:19 talks about the outline of the letter, which he says, "Write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, and the things which are to be hereafter." Right, And so that's that's an outline of the book of Revelations, in my opinion, right? So he's going to write about what he saw. He's going to write the things that are going on, and he's going to write about the things that are about to happen. So all that has to your point, I'm agreeing with you. To your point, whatever's being written about has to fit the time of what's going on. I mean, that's what that passage says, I believe, right? So you make a great point there. And then I was just thinking, Domitian, what people got to remember, and you made the point, in my opinion, Domitian was not persecuting Christians. His purpose was not just to persecute Christians. His purpose was to persecute anyone that would not recognize him as deity, right, and as God. So that was anybody and everybody, right? And that's why it was so broad and wide in the empire. Rome was very open. That's why they built the Pantheon, right? What's the Pantheon, right? The Pantheon is a place where you can worship all gods, right? Pantheon, right? And so your contrast there from what Nero was doing versus what Domitian was doing, it really, to me, drives home the point of and drives home that the time frame is the later date, right? I mean, I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying those are really good points that I also thought in my mind as well as, that makes total sense, right?
Yeah, so I'll capitalize on what you said, right, to apply some of those principles, right? That is, when I talk about the entire book of Revelation written at the same time, right, what that tells me, and we'll see this in coming weeks, is if I'm reading in the book of Revelation and I see a mention of something that might have happened in the 60s, that doesn't inherently mean we're talking from the perspective of the 60s. It merely means we could be mentioning something that has happened, right? That's what John is saying, right? Or that's what's saying in chapter 1, right? About things that have happened, right? So it's not out of the picture. It's not out of question to see historical references in the book of Revelation that may not have happened right at that moment. So for things to be in the book that are happening at that late date moment, right? That gives us some major clues as to when the book was written, right? Because it has to encompass all of it. And then I'll talk about the second thing you said as well, right? I talked tonight about the historical count of Rome and the persecution and things like that. There are some, and I'll mention it now because it'll come up in the next few weeks. There are some who question whether Domitian actually persecuted Christians at all. And they throw into question the entire argument of the late date because we have no evidence that Domitian persecuted Christians on the scale that's being talked about. And the problem with that is, just as Kevin mentioned, and I've mentioned a couple of times, is it wasn't exclusive to Christians. So many people who try to figure out, did Domitian actually persecute Christians, they look through history, they find all these evidences, and then they filter for ones that mention Christian, and that list is relatively short, if we're being honest. That list is short, though they are existent, right? Those sources are there talking about how he treated Christians. But if you allow yourself to view it from the scope that he wasn't merely targeting Christians, he was targeting anyone who refused him as a god, it doesn't have to mention Christian. You now open yourself to a much longer list of evidences to support this idea that Domitian thought he was a god. And if we can strongly support the idea through evidence that Domitian declared himself a god, declared for him to be worshipped, we know that's the historical context that Christians were living within. Therefore, we can assume Christians are going to struggle in that society in all of the ways that the book of Revelation talks about. We don't have to see the word Christian pop up through history to know Christians would have had it hard in that environment that is well documented. Any other comments or questions on anything so far? If not, we can wrap it up. We're going to continue next week. Yeah, we're going to continue next week talking specifically about the date of the book. And we're going to talk specifically about the late date next week and the arguments for it. The strongest evidence is why I believe that the late date is correct. We've already talked about some of them, right? But that was the point of this first class, to really lay the framework for that. But that is what we will focus on next week. So thank you for joining, and thank you for your questions. And come back next week with more questions if you got them, and we'll keep going through it.